Do we have live communication with people that are attending, or is that something that
Yeah,
you see? Or
yeah, there'll be a there you'll see attendees and they can ask questions. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to Cannabis Marketing Live. I'm your host, Jake Litke, the CEO at MediaJel. And today we have Nathan Johnson from Vern Biosciences, is it?
bioanalytics?
Bioanalytics. I almost got it right. Okay. So we're going to be talking about AI. We'll be talking about AI in actually a broad range of categories. We'll talk a little bit on, I'll talk a little bit how we use AI in marketing, but Vern does something very different than what we're normally talking about, which is marketing. Let's actually, Nathan, if you could just introduce yourself, talk about the wide array of letters that you have after your name, and how you found yourself doing what you're doing, and then tell us a little bit about Vern.
Yeah. Yeah. So my background is in cancer research. I originally went to school for two reasons. One was genetic engineering. So I had a PhD that was almost completed before switching into more of an AI focused role, which is bioinformatics and computational biology, which bottom line means biological data and combining AI or different tools to understand the complexity that is the biology. And so I originally cut my teeth at Harvard Medical School, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, several pharmaceutical companies before getting exposed to cannabis. And the reason why I was so intrigued on cannabis is because of just the wide range of applications that the plant has. And one of the most intriguing things to me was seeing cancer patients applying it to their skin for melanoma and seeing those tumors decrease, which got me really curious. And so my original role was to analyze vast amounts of data and try to figure out how to cure cancer using various tools. And when I saw what cannabis could do, I thought, hey, I want to jump ship and join the new industry. But what I quickly realized is just how little we really know about this plant. There's lots and lots of papers, there's thousands of papers over decades. But the reality is there's a lot more nuances as to what this plant does. And so what we do is we focus on plant health. Sick plants don't produce very well. Healthy plants produce better bud, better everything. And we use AI to develop tools as well as to analyze vast amounts of data to improve that process. And so we use, and one way to describe it, we use tools that are developed for cancer and apply it to cannabis.
Okay. Um, I think I have more questions now than I did before you started explaining what you're doing. So let's dig into some of those. Now, you said that you're applying your tools, and I want to get into what that means, tools. But you said you're focusing primarily on plant health,
Yep.
right? So what are some of the sort of broad strokes on ways that you're making plants more healthy? I mean, I've been in plenty of grows, and there's nutrients and light cycles and things that are more sort of botanical, obvious things to do. What are some things that what are you applying to make the plants healthy? Exactly.
Yeah. So if anybody has ever been into a commercial cannabis cultivation facility, you will quickly realize just how many plants there are. And what cannabis cultivators do is they literally manually check how well those plants are doing. And think about how fast it takes for a plant to respond to its environment. Like think about if you don't water your plant, it's going to respond within the day that it doesn't like that. Now imagine your lights, imagine you're pruning them, imagine all the things you're doing to these plants. And what's really amazing is a lot of this is manually remembered. A lot of these cultivators, a lot of these master growers remember what does each of these plants like and don't like. Imagine they like this nutrient, but not that nutrient. They like this insect and not that insect. And the list goes on and on and on. But if you have thousands and thousands of plants you have to manage, obviously that's just a very limited amount that you can actually do in a day. There's just only so many hours in a day. And so what we do and how we use the tools we have is we try to streamline that process. And so for one partner we have, for example, is Neatleaf. They have a robot system that takes images across the entire facility. We analyze and use that data to identify what is good and what's not good. So AI is really good at identifying things that are normal and things that are not normal. It's not always good at identifying why, but it's really good at identifying what should be the normal characteristics. And so we can use these kind of tools to identify this is a sick plant, this is not a sick plant. And so that triggers an action item on our team side to say, okay, let's test it and figure out why. And then we use AI on our side to develop better tools that can process lots of information. So there's lots of reasons on why, and combine the two to provide that little insight there.
Okay. So inside of a grow, let's say a larger grow, you can, let's say you've got cameras looking at all the plants and you can identify and let's differentiate between a sick plant, right? Because plants
Mhm.
do actually get illnesses and one that's just not happy, right?
Yep.
What do you see in the variants? I know that there can be hot spots, there can be places where
Mhm.
there's less airflow. What are the most common things that you're able to identify as problems? And then how do people actually address it once you identify it? Because you're analyzing and giving information on what the problem is, but I don't know if you're actually saying what they should do with that information.
We absolutely are. We
Okay.
help them design SOPs or improve their SOPs or do an audit of what they should be doing. But because there are so many problems that can happen, generally speaking, most operators don't have enough standard operating protocols to cover everything. They have some general ideas on things, but they don't usually have an idea on everything just because it's so complicated. And so where we come in to help with them is, okay, this area was identified as something's going wrong. The usual buckets are nutrients, environment, or an infection, or possibly human error or mechanical error. And so the idea is which bucket is going to be the problem. And how you identify which one those are is based on the pattern. So for example, if it's a human error, say it's someone who forgot to spray something, that pattern will look very different than a pathogen infection or an environmental infection. So say it's a microclimate issue. Maybe this area of the grow has a really high heat, or maybe the humidifier broke in that region. There's going to be different symptoms. Now they may be correlated. So for example, your humidifier breaks. Obviously, mold and mildew are going to love that humid environment. And so you'll see a huge spike in pathogens in those areas. And so it's always about that ebb and flow to be able to address the issue. And so sometimes it's a failure on the SOP, sometimes it's human error, sometimes it's just mechanical, and the list goes on. And that's why you kind of need all that data analysis to figure out rapidly, because also time is money. This plant only lives for a couple of months. If it takes you a month to figure out the problem, you've already lost half your cycle,
Yeah.
if or sometimes worse, depending on the situation.
Now, we were talking about visual tools, right? So
Mhm.
people can take photos, you can feed that into some sort of image processing software. Now, are you using some like commercially available tools or open source libraries? Like what is to the extent that you can share, of course, I don't
Yeah.
think any trade
Yeah,
secrets.
so it's an ever evolving process on what we have versus what other groups have. So some groups that we work with, so Gromix out of Canada, they have a really good mobile app software. It works pretty well in terms of getting a basic output. Anybody can download it, anybody can use it. Neatleaf is the main one that we primarily like to use because it's automated. We don't have to go and manually snap a picture.
Mhm.
Same thing with the grower. Most operators don't have enough people that can walk their entire field every day. They're hoping at best that they can walk the field every week. And the challenge with that is there's a lot of things can happen within a week. And so the nice thing about that kind of system is it takes a picture multiple times a day to figure out what's going on. And so in terms of image analysis is just the first layer to identify what's going on. There are also other AI type applications that you can do on the output of that. So we'll test thousands and thousands of samples across an operation to understand where an infection's at. And you can use data analysis tools to figure out, okay, where is this infection coming from based on the pattern that you see. And so when you get to that level, the human eye, there are certain limitations on how much information we can store in our brains at a time in terms of looking at data. And that's where graphics and all that kind of color coding really, really helps. But when you start doing that on a regular basis, it's while you could do it, why spend a couple hours doing it like this when you can use AI to rapidly speed up the process? Um, and one thing I should clarify is what do I mean by AI? Because there's a lot of people that use the term very loosely.
Yeah.
Um, so AI in its most um, broader sense is really coming from Turing, who is the father of computer science. And his definition of AI is the Turing challenge is you are talking to a computer behind a wall and you're asking the question, can I tell if it's a human or a computer? But that idea of AI is not what most people talk about when it talks about AI, because that's a very, very complicated solution. Think about how complicated you are as a human.
Hmm.
But in terms of AI, what I mean by AI is taking a bunch of data points and trying to figure out how to distinguish between two groups or two batches or two categories or numerical or stuff like that. So it's not AI in the sense of true AI, like think of like iRobot and these other kind of sci-fi movies. But real, what most people mean when they say AI is what they really mean is machine learning, which is the
Right.
power behind AI. And really what it is it can be as simple as mx plus b. Think of trying to draw a line. That's a simple variable, simple way of trying to figure out those numbers. And you can try to distinguish how you do make a decision based on that threshold. And that can be the most simple base form of how AI works from the math perspective.
Yeah.
So it can
Yeah.
get far more complicated from that.
Yeah.
So,
We use different levels of machine learning or AI in what we're doing, right? So we're
yep,
serving, say, several million ad impressions every day,
yep,
right? All
yep,
across the country for, most, cannabis companies, like with dispensaries and brands. And that's going to be across thousands of publishers with
absolutely.
hundreds of different placements. The creatives themselves are all unique to each other, and how the interplay is between this particular creative served at this time of the day in this city on this website, right? So you've got a pretty big multivariate situation going on there. And very small changes, even just like a classic A/B test of like, oh, is it a red shoe or is it a blue shoe? That can have a small change, like a 1% change in, say, your click-through rate. That when you make a change at the very beginning of the funnel, the output can be, that could double your revenue, right? Little changes like that. So that's largely machine learning is what's happening there because you're trying to inform the ad team on and the advertiser what's working and what's not. But there is actual what is, you know, everything is kind of debatable, but things that are more similar to AI where we now have algorithms that can make some of that decisioning on your behalf because the thing it's also happening too fast for humans, right? So an ad auction takes
Absolutely.
place in 150 milliseconds, right? So
Yep.
there's no way you can do that in real time. But you do want your bidder, the thing that's buying the impressions and bidding on your behalf, to be able to make decisions faster than, every day or every week potentially, because you can see trend line happen very quickly, depending on, what's going on in the world. Even, another example that people use is for using like external influences, the weather, right? You can change your bid factor based on whether it's raining or not. So, and obviously, like, are you selling umbrellas? Okay, then, it's raining. You run, more advertising during that time period. Um, but circling back to your process, you're writing some sort of software.
Mhm.
Again, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing, what have you found? Well, first of all, there's always the question of Python versus R. I don't know if that is a debate that goes on inside of your organization. Are you using one or both of those?
So I would even say it's even more expansive than that is C sharp, C plus, all the other
Okay.
programming languages as well. Because what any good computer scientist will say is that programming languages have pros and cons on all of them. JavaScript is good in one area, Java is good in another one, R is good in this one, Python's better that way. So for example, R has better visualization libraries than Python, for example. But from my experience, Python usually has a faster throughput on how well it can process data. Now, the reality behind the scenes, both Python and R can call C or these other languages and actually rapidly go through this data. Or you can just throw it up on AWS, 1,000 servers for all you care.
Yeah.
And so it's for me, it just depends on which one can get the job done faster. Because unless you're working with trillions of data points, it doesn't really matter on some level. But at the same time, like even Power BI or these other softwares that have really good visual analytics, if
Mhm.
you have the right infrastructure, it doesn't really matter at the end. It really just matters on ultimately what is your output goal, as well as what you're comfortable with in terms of programming. But I use both on a daily basis. I have programs on both on a daily basis.
Okay.
So I like them both equally. They both have their pros and cons, but
All right.
um,
Well,
managing R on the back end is a little bit more of a nightmare than Python.
all right.
So
We'll pull our heads up a little bit from the talk before we lose all of our audience.
that's
But
right.
for those of you in Zoom, there is a Q&A section. You can ask questions here. If you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, I don't see those questions though. So Zoom, go ahead and ask questions. We'll answer them. Um, all right. So can you talk about some real world results of the improvements that you've been able to help, a grow operation with, of you were able to identify these problems and they were able to resolve it, and that resulted in some sort of positive outcome?
Yeah. So the most commonly we'll get a call when literally the plants are falling over and they're dying or they're really, really sick.
Hmm.
Or we'll get another call when, hey, my THC percent level is drastically lower than it should be. And then they're always scratching their heads as to what do I do next? For me, those are kind of the best case scenarios for us in the sense of we'll have the biggest impact when we improve that situation. Because usually if they have that situation, they now have gone from profitability to not profitable anymore. Because most operations don't have that level of they're okay with throwing away that much plant material or they're willing to able to handle that much of a loss. And so we have a couple of good use cases where they had close to 90% infection rate for various pathogens, and we were able to get it down to less than 1%. And they would say, we went from red to black for the first time ever in our company's existence, as an example. And it's just because think of like if you have the flu, think about if an entire facility had the flu for a year and it reduces your revenue by half. Most operations can't handle that,
Yeah.
especially with the investor framework at the moment where there's not a lot of extra capital that's relatively cheap. A lot of businesses don't have that infusion of capital that they can rely on. And so most of them are relying on trying to be a good business. And once they get these kind of big infections or then when they have these big problems come in, it's really hard for a lot of them to recover, just because it takes time for things to get fixed. You can't just flip a switch and magically everything works.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
unfortunately,
All right. So let's we have a question here, so we can actually get into that. And
yep.
some of this may require some creative thinking because we're gonna try to go a little further up in the supply chain, so to speak. So we've been talking about, the grow itself, and some obvious ways that you can help that situation. Now, if we move up the life cycle into like actual, and this is the question we have here, like supply chain and ERP. Once, okay, let's say we've solved the problem, we've got healthy plants.
Mhm.
Now, um, have you looked at how ML or AI tools can help the next stage of the process?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we have been exploring is how do you select the strains or how do you select what plants to grow? How do you know what the market wants? Because it takes a cultivator 3 months to 6 months to be able to grow that option.
Mhm.
And so in terms of using AI in the supply chain, using AI in terms of decision making, there are a couple of good companies that will help you with this. So Canold is one really good company in the area. Is not most AI tools that are in the cannabis space are not just buy the software and move on. It's more of a consulting type relationship from my experience. But they'll use all these tools on the behind the scenes to help you address your questions. So for example, ask the question on inventory management. How do you know what supplies you should keep on your shelf?
Mhm.
Grocery stores, a lot of these other companies that have really short shelf lives, they have really good supply chain softwares to make that decision for them. Because think about bananas. They have a short shelf life on how long you can sell them for. So you have to worry about how you ship them from this location, that location, and so on and so forth. Same thing with cannabis. It has a shelf life. So there are tools out there that you can help with AI and use that to kind of predict it. A lot of the companies out there are really, I would call startups. They're just starting getting going in terms of that kind of forefront. But Cannell is a good company in terms of they've been doing this for years and helping a lot of cannabis companies to use that data. Um, so some good examples of how you use AI. Think about which products you should have on the shelf, how long you should have them for there. Is there any kind of historical data you can draw from? Is there anything around 420 that people want on the shelf versus a different sales date? Is there any kind of patterns that you can loosen from? And yeah, the list goes on and on and on about what you can do to make your decisions better. Because the whole goal is you're trying to predict, and you have to have a ability to predict before the day of, because it takes time to get it on that shelf and in front of a consumer.
Okay.
Um,
And can you spell what is canold? How do you spell that?
Canold, Canold.
Okay.
They are Matt is the name of their CEO. His background is in business analytics, is where he came from. And so he applies that background and that data into an operation, a business operation. So he'll use Power BI, he'll use all these different tools behind the scenes. They're a metric user, so they can pull in all this data from all your company and historically help you identify areas that you can improve your supply chain.
Okay. And how detailed can that be? Can it be down to this percentage of THC is selling better than this other percentage, and you should, change your grow style based on that?
So there's data sources that you can get in information by product names. You can get them from by strain names. You can get it from what company is selling where, what company is selling this. So for example, you can do an audit of all of Massachusetts and ask the question, what strain name was sold in the last week? And so there are data sources from a number of resources that can pull in that raw data. The challenge with it is what do you do with that information? How do you distill it into an action item for your company? And so that's where a company like Canold can help you with that question. But there is also a number of other sources that can pull in that data, that raw data. So think of the COAs that are come off of a material when a lab test. You can get that information in there. You can do that mapping of, okay, product name times this percent times sales. Is there any kind of grouping or clustering that can be done? Very doable. But the question is how do you know then, is that going to be a constant pattern or just a one-off type of thing? And so that's where it gets complicated, especially with the cannabis market and with people changing their minds on what's considered to be good at this point. Um, there is a lot of product names that are have very high impact, but there's also a lot of ambiguity as to what that product will do for somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we're normally operating again like a sort of at the end stage, which is getting the products to consumers, getting
Right.
awareness of the products or the dispensary or whatever it is. And so, it's interesting to hear all this because this is all this stuff is all way in the past by the time that we're involved.
Right.
Um, However, we do look at sales data, right? So one of the things that we've done with our platform is, we're integrated with the e-commerce platform. So we can see when someone places online orders and we can even see what's in the basket that are driving purchases. And what we're looking at again is what was the creative itself? What did the ad unit look like? Where was it served? All those types of variables I talked about earlier. And how does that impact sales, right? And you will find you always find interesting things in the data, right? Even when we've got a pretty long history doing this, we still find surprises sometimes in the data, like that this particular, ad unit was driving, what is it, driving sales of flowers, is it driving sales of high AOV, like large basket shoppers or, smaller ticket items. And we can use that to drive again, really ultimately our advertisers care about revenue, right? They want sales and they want, more sales and larger basket items, so larger basket values. And so we can use that information to determine who we should be marketing to in order to drive those sales. Uh,
Absolutely.
all right, so we talked about growing, talked about the using AI or ML to influence what strains you might be growing. Um, Now, what about further past that? Because we're still kind of talking at the sort of, I would say, cultivation layer, unless you're a vertically integrated company. Um,
Mhm.
have you seen an interplay between for cultivator who's not a vertically integrated, but is, selling as a wholesaler? Um, have you seen any interaction between the wholesale and the actual manufacturer or the brand, where people have used ML to help that process at all? And this is like I'm not sure if the answer is yes or no here.
Well, I would say the answer is what should be the reality versus what is the reality.
Mhm.
What should be the reality is you should have an algorithm that you can actually quantify based on certain quality factors in your product on what it should sell for. So, for example, what is the percent THC that this product should sell for, and correlate that to all the products, etc. That's how it should be done to some level, if that's what you think the indicator variable is on the selling point. But the reality is, it's a lot more complicated than that. Because the user experience, some users will see that THC percent and make the decision accordingly. But other users will say, I want a more wholesome experience. I want a more involved experience. I realize that cannabis is a lot more complicated than just that. And so, unfortunately, most wholesalers usually have a cutoff point on what they have for different tiers. They'll say, arbitrarily in this state, it's this percent above this sells at this point, or this below this sells at a different point. Or if you're in California or other areas, if you grow, outdoor versus indoor versus mixed light, you have this one category. And then based on this percent or that percent, you get this different tier. So you have more like a 6 tier system on where it sells. The reason why they do that is because all those have different costs associated with them, and they also have different marketing ability on what it is, because there's a different perception on outdoor cultivation versus indoor. Whether that's granted or not really depends on who's growing it. I've seen really amazing growers who grow indoor, who grow the best thing in the world, but then you have other ones that grow outdoor that can have the same thing, and opposite of that as well. You're not guaranteed just because you grow indoors, you're going to get the best thing in the world, or the most consistent thing. It can be a batch to batch variability as well. And so what I've seen, so Canalits Alert is a really good software platform for that. So what they do, their data model is they pull in e-commerce data that's publicly available and kind of estimate as to what's being sold and not in real time. So on a daily basis, they have an estimate on what's being sold. And you can use that data to kind of infer what's going on. But the challenge with it is because marketing or brand names can be arbitrary. There's not necessarily an association between this name and outcome. There can be, depending on if you're well respected within a space, but generally speaking, it just happens too fast for that to happen. And so there should be a way to do that effectively. But in terms of the reality of what I've seen in terms of how it's sold, definitely not. And month to month, that wholesale price also changes as well based on supply and demand. So winter months tend to be a little bit higher price than the fall or the summer because you have the outdoor supply coming in.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's not it makes it very hard for our cultivators' life when they can't really predict what they're going to be able to sell it for. All they can really do is minimize their costs and hope they can get the highest amount possible at the right time.
And that was, you say Canalytics?
Can't let me pull up there.
It's can something. Everything's
Yeah,
can.
can't lits or lit
Either
alerts.
can or green or leaf. It seems that's
There
you got to have one of those three in your name.
you go. It's lit alerts is the name of it.
Okay. Lit alerts. Great. There it is. LIT.
They're primarily available in the Northeast, but they'll rapidly expand across the West.
Okay. Great. What are some other tools that you've come across that you would recommend for people to check out? again, there's I don't even necessarily know the right questions to ask, so I'm going to ask you, have you
Yeah.
volunteered things?
Let me pull up all the, yeah, so a lot of these e-commerce platforms that sell and will also sell the data on how well things are going.
Hmm.
So there are some that it's always complicated by the fact of how many people are on their platform versus how much data they have to share.
Yeah.
And one nice thing, reason why I like lit alerts is that they don't have to be on their platform for the data to be available. You don't have to say yes to them before they can actually scrape that information because it's all publicly available. Whereas if you are using an e-commerce platform and that sales data internally, you may not necessarily have available with that unless you work with the brand itself. And so they, I'll have to remember, I think Hoover Analytics is one of the companies that I've talked to that had a really good data package.
Hmm.
Um, Weed Maps, of course, they will have some data that they'll sell on how things perform. Things of those kind of natures, you can get large data packages to analyze market trends. Um, from my experience, because and the reason why we know this, even though we focus on cultivation, is I do believe there is a correlation between what strains sell and also the decisions that should be made in the cultivator space. We just haven't figured out or cracked it on what that would make sense because there's such ambiguity on brand names and strain names. Um, OG Kush in Massachusetts may not be OG Kush in California, for example.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
OG Kush grown by this grower versus that grower are going to have different outcomes. So, how do you actually predict how well it sells when you have that ambiguity in the data?
What would you say, and you may not have empirical data on this, but for, let's just say that average consumer, not necessarily like the super connoisseur or the super newbie, but the average cannabis connoisseur, when we're talking about strains, how much do you think people are even aware of the variability between, let's take OG Kush, for example, which may be a very two different plants entirely on the East Coast versus West Coast, or even from one city to the next, depending on what people have decided to call it. And then you've got the variability of, was it grown in my backyard? I've grown some plants. I'm not very good at it. I did produce some flower. I don't think it was fit for anyone's shelf, um, but it was fine. So yeah, so like a inexperienced grow versus, the best green thumb in the world. How much, first of all, how much variability do you think there is in in terms of THC content, terpene content, all of that? What does that spectrum look like?
So the illustration I would use is the different phenotypes that are around the country to illustrate how variable the plant is. So there are a couple of phenotypes in Maine and Massachusetts and a couple areas around the country where the seed companies or the clone companies will give the exact same clone, the exact same seeds to a whole group of different breeders. And
Oh,
they'll actually have a competition on who can grow it best. And if you look at the output, you will see a very wide range on what that plant can do. And you're talking like all the way from 30% THC to single digit THC percents to terpene levels can be drastically different. And so it all has to boil down to the explanation that cannabis is a weed, I think is very true. Cannabis is a very resilient plant. You can put it in the winter, you can put it in a snowstorm, hurricane, you name it, it will survive. It will still grow its bud, it will still survive on. But it takes an expert grower to get all the wonderfulness out of cannabis. It takes someone who really, really specializes on how to mold and mature that plant. And that comes with usually decades of experience from my experience. Usually you don't get someone their first or second year that can just get a wonderful bud the first time. It usually takes lots and lots of serial practices and so on and so forth. And so from my experience, the first problem is the naming convention really has no correlation as to what it will do. So some breeders will have some sort of nod to where they got the cut from when they name something. So they'll say they'll have Kush in the name if it came from that lineage. Some breeders won't. Some breeders will have some sort of nod to what the plant can do, and some will not. And so it's really correlated to who's growing it, who the brand is, and what their philosophy on growing is. So for some growers, for example, their focus is on really strong terpene profile in small batches. Some are more like the Budweiser of cannabis and trying to get you a mass value for a low cost. And so all those nuances, really asking questions of the bud tender and of who the grower is, sometimes even meeting the grower, is really the best way of knowing the quality. For example, I won't smoke or touch plants that I don't know the grower because I know how nuances can be. And also, it's fun to have that relationship with them. But unfortunately, not people are going to have that kind of correlation
Yeah.
that I get. I mean, for all you don't even know where these facilities grow. I mean, unless you actually have that relationship, they won't even be listed online or anywhere. You'd have to actually know from them where the address is. And so it's the unfortunate reality, but I should think more growers should be more out there in front of people to say, hey, this is what the brand is that we're doing. But the way I would evaluate it is that COA is your first line of defense because it tells you all the nuances that are in there. But you also have to realize that that COA was done at a different time point than what you have in front of you. The other one is the misnomer of hybrid or indica or sativa means really nothing. And the reason for it is those are botanical definitions, meaning that they have certain characteristics. But in terms of what that plant or that bud will do right in front of you, it's a hand wavy explanation as to what it will do for you. The other thing is batch to batch variability. So batch from this month and this month, depending on who the cultivator is, it may not be the exact same. And so the best growers will have the same, but generally speaking, most don't have that consistency. Especially the larger they are, the more inconsistent it will be. So what I would say if I go into an operation is how big is the operation? Is this a 5,000 or 10,000 square foot grow? What is their, how do they make their batches? Are they growing 10 plants at a time or are they growing 2,000? Try to get a sense as to what the philosophy on how they grow is will give you an idea on how passionate they are on their plant. Because the ones that are most passionate will talk to you about literally everything about that plant. And they'll know everything about that plant because they babied it from basically from a seedling. And so those are the growers that you want because you know they're going to take care of the plant and they're going to be very careful what they put into that plant.
So if I, let's say, I decided to grow a bunch of plants in, well, not my garage. Let's use a bigger
You get a
example.
garage.
Yeah. But no, but I mean a large enough set of plants where your software is going to go in and look at what the plant is doing.
Mhm.
So let's take me. I've grown some plants in my backyard, so
Yep.
little to no real experience. How much would having your software analyzing what's going on with my little grow operation get me closer to producing, a better product? Like how much help can I get?
From our software, from our data, we need to have a lot more information than just a small grow. So we can help in terms of testing your plants, identify if they're healthy or not. But in terms of really optimizing your process, it requires hundreds of plants or thousands of plants. And that's just because the scalability is where it really helps. But if you are there in person, you're touching the plant, you're looking at the plant every single day, you are honestly going to have a better experience with the plant than our software will because you can touch it, you can smell it, you can feel it. We're limited by image, we're limited by data. We don't have scientists as a group, we don't have a test yet that we can say this is what defines quality in cannabis. We have lots of hints, i.e., that it has this humidity, it has this curing time, it has this terpene profile, it has this cannabinoid profile. But the reality is that we're only testing or sampling a very small number of the complexity that is cannabis. And so being someone who touches and feels it in person is always going to be a better experience than any software at the moment. Eventually that will change, but we don't have enough data points to really be able to get there.
Are you currently or planning on other inputs than images, for example, soil pH or some sort of like take a cutting of a leaf and put it in some machine that gives you some information about it?
Yes, absolutely. We have nutrient analysis that we can do. So we know how much nutrients are in the soil, the sap, or the plant. We have data on the pH or the EC that comes off of the plant. The challenge with is how expensive it is to capture that data. So, for example, there's a company called Aurora that has soil sensors that you can put in every single pot. But imagine if you're a large grower that does 25,000 clones a week. That's a lot of sensors.
Yeah.
That's a lot of sensors that you hope don't break, and so on and so forth. And you'd have to have on the order of several 100,000 of those sensors to actually get it in every single pot. And so while there is pros and cons to doing that, the reality is you're usually working with less data than you need for your model to perform appropriately. And that's part of the trick of machine learning. That's part of the trick of doing that analysis is that you're hoping to fill in the blanks on what's going on with as limited data as possible and cheap data as possible. And that's always the challenge is, okay, you're missing pH on this water. Is there anything that you can use to infer what's going on there? Same thing with EC, same thing with all the different variables that you're hoping to capture.
Yeah, you mentioned EC. What is that? I'm not familiar with that term.
Oh, elastic. Oh my gosh, now I can't remember what
Neither are
the
you.
basically what it means is that when you have pure water, when you
Yeah.
have like pure water that's been reverse osmosis or RO, it's just water. There's nothing else in there. There is literally just H2O. When you start putting in salts, when you start putting in soil, when you
The
start putting
electrolyte
other
content?
stuff, actual nutrient content, the that EC level basically tells how much input is going into the plant in terms of how much it will absorb and things of that nature. There are different numbers that people like to use when they're cloning or they're growing. It's very subjective based on experience and based on what they're using on what the optimal EC is. And so, like, if you put in a bunch of potassium, you name it in terms of what you're throwing in there, it will change that number. It'll change that absorption in those roots, and it'll change what the plant is actually doing in real time. And so, it's a combination between EC and pH on what the plant can uptake. Too acidic pH, it will burn the roots, or too basic will do the same thing. And so, there's always an optimal window on what you want.
Okay. What
That makes
about
sense.
what about music? I've heard people play. I mean, have you seen any scientific
Of
studies
course.
that music helps?
The classic high school experiment with the science fair with your music and the plants. We know from the scientific literature that plants can respond to vibrations. We know that for a fact. They have the ability to respond to vibrations, just like all your other environmental cues, whether it's light, whether it's water, whether it's wind, whether it's an insect. Even has the ability that if its neighbor is getting chewed on by an insect, it will actually release chemicals that it will let the other plants know, be careful as a kind of a deal. And so we know that vibrations do help the plants. We do know different patterns can help versus not. What I don't know is if you're playing rock and roll in this group versus classical music in this group, does it really have that much of a difference?
Yeah, Metallica or Mozart? We
I
don't
was
know.
like, I don't really know, but I do know that vibrations are helpful for the plant. And whether or not just having a fan on would get you the same effect as having Mozart on, I don't know. But I do know that there are lots of people that swear by it.
Okay,
But
fair enough. I want to circle back to something that you were talking about earlier in kind of how you transitioned into the cannabis industry. You said that you saw or you mentioned studies about melanoma and cannabis oil, I'm assuming, being
yep.
applied topically. Is that just something you read, or were you involved in that somehow, or how did that how did
So
it get on your radar?
yeah. So when I was so at the time, this was back in 2019. My co-founder now, Mark, he's a contract lawyer in Massachusetts. So he does IP work, civil litigation, contract work. And so 2018 bill came around, everybody got really excited about hemp, and just Massachusetts, just like everywhere else, got really excited about growing a bunch of hemp. Unfortunately, what happened in Massachusetts, but also happened in other states, is the seeds that they bought were supposed to be feminized, i.e., mainly female, and they were not done properly. And so what happened to a lot of these hemp farmers is that they got males and females, and they didn't make a lot of money because of that poor distinction. And so at the time, Mark was hired to help these farmers with what do you do next? Do you sue them? What do you do? And so he's point out to me, I was never exposed to cannabis up to that point, besides the DARE program, don't touch it. And so he suggested, why don't you just come to this farm with me? And what was really interesting is when I got on the farm, the farmer had been using cannabis for 5 rounds of cancer to kill the melanoma that was on his skin. And he was in an active treatment at the time I came through, and I was like, what is this? What does this mean? Like, I've never seen
Yeah.
this before. And he mentioned, yeah, this is my 5th round of getting these melanoma tumors on my skin. I just apply this extract of hemp and it goes away after a couple of weeks, which I thought, that's a little odd.
Yeah.
And then I got
Sounds.
online, started talking to people, started talking to more and more people. And one thing in science and the scientific method is that you always start off with a story. You always start off with an observation because you don't want to just blindly go into something and hope it works. You need to have a clue as to where to look.
Yeah.
And what I noticed after talking to several people is that this is not just an odd thing. This is actually a consistent observation from people. But the challenge with science, the challenge with clinical trials is the people who survive cancer and have cannabis applied to it are the ones who are talking, and the ones that didn't work on aren't there talking. And so how do you know, like, what is the true story? What's the true nature behind this? There's obviously something going on here that seems to work. But the challenge is what is the mechanism of action? Like how? Because trying to design a clinical trial, trying to design a proof that this actually works is really, it's much easier if you know where to look or how to look. And so that's why we're not focused at Verm on the clinical side of cannabis, because I think we don't have enough data to really appropriately judge that clinical trial. Because we know that THC CBD by itself doesn't do the job. There's something else in the so-called entourage effect that seems to be there that's necessary, but what combination is the big question mark? And I
So,
would go after that after we have a little bit more information on the plant. So,
so you're saying you can't just like break open a distillate vape cart and pour it on your arm and
I mean, it's going to do nothing, or it's going to help, or it's going to
yeah,
make it worse. I mean, that's the big scenario, and that's why a lot of medical doctors won't recommend it because they don't want to make your situation worse. And so, Um, and that's and that's a nature in all preclinical studies. That's a reason why it cost a drug company a couple $1 billion to get to market. Because on average, most scientists will agree with this that 80% of your experiments don't work. And why is the big question mark. Um, because if it makes it worse, I mean, it's just the worst thing you want to do when you go to a clinical trial is make it worse for the patients.
sure. All right, so we're running up on time here. I did want to take a few moments to talk about maybe some predictions that you might have about well, machine learning and AI. And that is true. I would say that most of the time when someone talks about AI, it's really machine learning that they're talking about.
Yep,
Although that has changed rapidly in the last 12 months, right? There's
absolutely.
actual AI products out there. So, um, what do you think about generative AI and some of the tools that are out? I mean, because you've got, Llama's open source, you can build things on top of that. You can even run it on your, like I can run Llama on my laptop now at this point if I want to.
Yep.
Uh, how do you see this new round of generative AI impacting what you're doing specifically and just the industry from a broader perspective?
So the first thing is customer support will get better. So the nice thing about a lot of these generative AI products is that if you have a bunch of SOPs or product manuals or information on what you do, you can dump it into these AI type platforms and they'll read it, learn it. And then when a customer comes in and asks a basic question about what does this product do, it can spit out a reasonable answer and it can troubleshoot to a certain degree, if you depend on what information you feed it. So a lot of the customer support chat engines, a lot of those things that are on websites right now and continue to get better will be mainly AI on the first level. And a lot of companies already currently do this, but it will get better as time goes on. And what I mean by better is, especially in our world, when we have more scientific, more troubleshooting type questions, like why didn't this work? Which may not actually be in our literature, but may need to require some Google searches to pull in that information. That generative AI that has that ability will bring in a little bit more basic information to answer that question. And that will go to not just in cannabis as alone, but as a whole for all markets. Um, in cannabis, because the big push for a lot of investment in cannabis is on making software better and making data access better, is that we're going to start seeing on one level, I think testing regulations will get better because I think more and more states will start pooling their data and they'll start seeing what does or does not work. Hopefully, they make the decision correctly. Well, it all depends on decision makers, but that's will be possible as time goes on. Other things that will start to happen is I think product recommendations will get better. I think product recommendations based on that COA data, based on user experience, will get better and better. The average user spends several months trying to figure out what product will work better for them. And I think my personal belief on why a lot of people who are new to the cannabis industry just walk away is because they get one or two experiences that don't quite align with what everybody tells them. And they're like, oh, whatever, move on.
Yeah.
And I think to really use cannabis on where you can use it, you need to have a better user base or better customer experience to better align with what they're looking for. So if you are an 80-year-old woman who has arthritis, you should have a different recommendation than someone who's a 70-year-old man who has irritable bowel disease or whatever.
Yeah.
This stuff works for that, but not the same strain, not the same product, not the same outcome, not the same type of product. And so you need to have that better recommendations, or if you just want to have a recreational experience. I mean, just taking one puff of what strain versus that strain. I mean, if you're not aware, you could really be in trouble.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think everyone's got a story or two,
oh yeah,
usually around
100%.
edibles. But how many years do you think we'll have this recorded so we can see if you're right or not and however many years you think, but before you can walk into a dispensary, do like a mouth swab, put it into a container and have an AI chatbot ask you what experience you want, and then it tell you which strain, specifically what is in stock, not just OG Kush, but like this particular one is what you're looking for.
So we have actually a prototype on that kind of concept because we were curious if we could do it with the data that's available right now. And based on our limited prototypes, we could actually get pretty good at recommending a product based off of the data that's off of publicly available, as well as a simple 10 questionnaire from a customer. Now, a swab of the person, that would be doable if we had the DNA markers that would align with how do you metabolize THC. So if there's mutations along your THC metabolism pathway, you could have like a ranking on how well you metabolize THC versus all these other things. There
Yep.
are a couple of companies that can do that to a certain degree, but I think it's just beginning on that type of database. And the reason why I say that is the human genome was sequenced in 2001. We have been, as a bioinformatician, this is what we do for a living. I analyze all that data to figure out that GWAS study or that genetic wide association study. And there isn't always a strong correlation to everything to that outcome. What I mean by that is mutation at this location will correlate in 10% of people to this thing or that thing. And so it's taking the human disease consortiums decades to be able to gather much data to do those things fairly well. And so with cannabis, until there is a really nice feedback loop between customer experience, product, DNA, and so on and so forth, it's going to be very hard to build that recommendation better until that kind of pathway is mapped out better. How do you incentivize someone to give you the data you're looking for so you can build a better mousetrap?
Yeah.
And so I would say probably in 5 years, we would probably have a really good prototype that would work pretty decently.
All right.
But DNA sequencing takes longer than just to swab and walk up to the counter. It takes weeks to do that kind of process.
Or, all right, I'll make it easier for you then, because
Yep.
are you familiar with Endocanna? You know,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yep.
So I did that, right? But I didn't have to do a swab because I had previously done a DNA test, right? So
Yep.
I didn't. I just gave him the file, right? You just link it to
Absolutely.
your 23andMe. So no, you don't have to do a swab, but let's just say you give access or upload your file.
Hmm.
I had a conversation with him actually on this, and it was pretty interesting. And so I
Yep.
sent in my DNA.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
What's that?
That's exactly what I'm talking about is
Yeah.
the ability to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an interesting report. I think there are some things that are easier to identify than others. For example, like obviously there is a negative interaction with people that are prone to schizophrenia and cannabis, right? That's a marker that's easier to pick up and more of a kind of a red light
Hmm.
versus this is something great for you. It's just really identifying this whole thing is not good for you, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and that's the signal versus noise, or the how strong that correlation is going to be different based on different characteristics. So, like your THC metabolism, that's a pathway that's been mapped out decently. But what about all the other minor cannabinoids? What about all the other cannabinoids and how they interact with each other? That's definitely something that we don't know a whole lot about. And so, how do you make that recommendation engine based on all those things? And so, I would say companies like Indocana are those kind of forefront companies that will make that possible. And they do work pretty well for the data that they have, but you're also talking about how they built those engines or how they built that information was on data that's been gathered for decades and was invested with billions of dollars from the government in terms of all those grants to support that data research.
Mhm.
So with descheduling, it will go faster because that will open up that pool, but it also will take time for that effect to be seen. So even if we descheduled today and all that grant money was available today, it would still take a couple of years for those experiments to get hypothesized and actually get done to be able to report those studies. So I
Yep.
would say in 5 years, we will have a pretty good prototype, but I think it's going to be closer to 10 years before we actually have good data to be able to go after this.
All right. I got one last bonus question for you. Brought up minor cannabinoids. Um, do you have any opinions on what would maybe like I found THCV products. I like
Mhm.
those quite a bit. But there's obviously CBG, CBN, there's all these different
Yep.
cannabinoids. Do you have any personal favorites that you like that most people aren't aware of, like of the lesser known opening act bands?
I mean, a lot of the minor cannabinoids are with THC are starting to show that they're stronger on their binding ability than THC itself. So THCP, for example. And
I've never heard
so
of that one.
yeah, so that's I have a automatic search for the scientific literature every day, and I get 15 plus papers every single day that gets published. Like it's insane amount of publications that get done with cannabis.
Oh wow.
Um, and that's why I think it's going to be really, really interesting once the floodgates of research actually gets opened, in terms of how to distill all that data. But I mean, honestly, that's the one nice thing about cannabis, and this is why I think people rotate their crops so much, is because people like to try what it can do.
Mhm.
And I would just say play with it in terms of what it can possibly do for you. There's been lots of research that shows that different minors seem to be more powerful than the main ones that we talk about. But the challenge is because the breeders on the genetic side haven't bred for a really high amount of CBG plants or whatever you name it, we don't really know what it can really do. And so if you're talking about only 0.1% of that minor cannabinoid is there versus all the other things, how much an effect does it have versus if it was actually a 5% or 10%? And so that's why breeders live for what they're doing and why they're always doing pheno hunts, because they're looking for those different variations. Um, that's why we do what we do, is because we want to be along with that ride with them to see what
Answered
happens.
like a true scientist. A lot of data, but no answer to the question.
Yeah, well, no, more experimentation, more money.
Sure. Yes, need more data.
That's right.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time today. I found an interesting conversation. We did get a little nerdy there. Hopefully, we didn't scare too many people off. Um, how can people get a hold of you if they are looking to? I assume the people that are most relevant for you are going to be people that are trying to grow better cannabis, right?
Yep, absolutely.
How can people get a hold of you to ask you questions that you may or may not answer?
Vermbio.com is where the main funnel comes through. LinkedIn is where we have the best representation. Just reach out, talk, and maybe me and maybe one of other people at Vern that responds. But if it's a complicated question, eventually it'll come down to me. And so
Yep.
the team will eventually ping me before it gets to myself or the other scientist at Vern.
Okay.
So
Great. Well, this has been another episode of Cannabis Marketing Live. More cannabis, less marketing this time, but really interesting nonetheless. I'm Jake Litke, CEO of MediaJel. If you have questions about marketing cannabis, please reach out to me directly. I can be found on LinkedIn or just go to MediaJel.com. That's gel with a J. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
thanks, Jake.